a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
Well, welcome to James Mannion and Kate McAllister, the co-authors of a new book published by John Catt called "Fear is the Mind Killer." Anyone who's a science fiction aficionado might well recognise that as an important line from Frank Herbert's seminal sci-fi novel Dune. Can I start, James and Kate, by asking you why you decided to use that line as the title of your book?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So as we were writing the book, we were trying to think, what's the big idea that sort of that unites this whole approach to learning to learn that we've been so immersed in for a long time. And as you'll know from reading the book, a really key part of what this approach is about is a complex intervention. So you take lots of little ideas and you stick them all together, and the idea being that the benefits accrue from each of those ideas stack up and interact, and you get this bigger effect size overall. So that's the theory anyway. And so by its very nature, this intervention is about lots of little things. It's not about one big thing. And so we were sort of thinking, is there a big idea that sits behind this? And if so, what is it? And there was this one line. There's a colleague of ours, a good friend who taught alongside us on this learning to learn curriculum called Paul Meredith. When I interviewed him for my PhD, I asked him a question, which was, to what extent has teaching this learning skills curriculum, to what extent has that spilt over into your teaching of science? And he said that it had massively transformed his approach to teaching science. And in particular, he kept talking about fear of failure and how kids are really afraid to stick their hand up, to get involved in a conversation, to present something to the class, even sometimes to commit pen to paper. He said that some kids would sit before a blank sheet of graph paper for 20 minutes or more because they couldn't, as soon as they start to draw the graph, there's an opportunity for them to make a mistake. So the fear of failure just sort of keeps them paralyzed. And so he said that he just kept coming back to that idea over and over again. And he said it's like that Dune film. It's like fear is the mind killer. It stops you from doing stuff. It keeps you in your lane and makes you afraid even there. And so we came back to that. And then we were thinking fear of failure was a really big part of what we were talking about. Lots of what we did was about gently but persistently nudging our students to just venture out of their comfort zones and to try new and more difficult and more challenging things, and to experience failure in all different kinds of ways, and to learn from that. And because fundamentally, lots of the book is about metacognition, which, as you know, is a sort of a mind-based thing, right? It's like monitoring and controlling your thought processes. But there's all kinds of stuff going on in somebody's ability to be a self-regulated learner. And although there's cognitive and metacognitive elements of that, if you really strip away, it's fundamentally an emotional relationship that a child has to their learning. They have a good feeling about some subjects, or sometimes they see that a certain thing's coming up in their timetable and they have a little spike of, oh God, it's that again. Or I've got to sit next to that kid in that lesson, and so on. So we sort of settled on this idea that the fear of failure, is one of the biggest ideas that we need to get our heads around if we're going to help kids to take risks and to learn to embrace failure for what it is, which is really just feedback in wolf's clothing,
Great. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much for that. So the book essentially is, on one level anyway, it's the story of some work that you both did together at a particular school. And Kate, you were heading up this learning to learn curriculum in Seaview School. Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind that and how you got involved?
Sure. So I had been teaching for a few years by then. And when I first started teaching, I qualified as a modern foreign languages teacher. And
Right.
So one of my first observations as a teacher was that it wasn't all down to me. And that kind of came as a bit of a surprise, to be honest. I tried very hard, studied very hard at all my teaching practice, and spent lots and lots of time doing all of the things that I had been told would create a positive climate for learning and make it possible for students to be successful. And it didn't always seem to work. And the observation that some children seemed to be able to get themselves ready to learn, seemed to be able to overcome challenges when they presented themselves, and other children didn't seem to have the ability to do that. And I didn't yet know why, but I knew that it was interesting to me. And so that's when when I started trying to understand more about how learning works from the perspective of the learner rather than from the perspective of the teacher. And as my teaching practice developed, I became head of department, and I started to put into place strategies and policies and get the whole team to kind of be singing from the same hymn sheet. And again, it was still all teacher-led. Everything about what we were trying to help the students achieve was teacher-led. And I realized that it wasn't a sustainable model. If the teacher left or if something changed, then the students still weren't fully equipped to do this work by themselves. And someone gave me a really good line just the other day, that learning begins with the learner. I wish I'd had that a long time ago. So thanks, Ollie, for giving me that idea. But that's effectively what we started to do, is to hand over the responsibility piece by piece to the children themselves for their learning. And so the first few iterations involved opening mind, personal learning and thinking skills, looking at social and emotional aspects of learning. It was the early 2000s, and just beginning to cherry pick the things that I felt were working for my students in my context, and start to begin to put together a program. So the first program I put together was called the Junior Model, and it wasn't perfect, but it had a lot about it that worked. And so by the time I got to Seaview, I was given the opportunity to build a team. I learned an awful lot more about what I wanted to do, and that's where I met James. And he brought all of his kind of academic research knowledge, huge amount of knowledge and experience into the team, and we kind of grew it from there.
Great. Okay. So at that point, James, the point that you got involved, can you take over the story a little bit, or maybe add in a little bit about how you got to that place where you started with Kate?
Yeah, so I met Kate in the interview room. She'd been brought in by our head teacher who had previously worked with her, and she had to set up this team. And so we had a competitive selection process to decide who would be on this team, which is one of the fundamental things that I think that we did that was different to what's happened before. In other schools and in the past, things like Learning to Learn have often been given to teachers who just happen to have a bit of time left on their timetable. They sort of get backfilled after all the GCSE classes and so on have been staffed. And often, so they sometimes refer to them as skeptical conscripts in the literature, people who've just been sort of kicked up the backside and told, get in there and do that. And often their heart isn't in it. And if you do that, you really oughtn't bother, because it just won't work if you do that. You need to have people who are up for doing it. So we formed this team of teachers. There was 5 of us in that first year. It's quite a small school. And we would have the whole of year 7 for 5 lessons a week to do with whatever we saw fit. The head teacher was very much a sort of a distributed leadership type guy. And he said, over to you, just like help to get these kids to learn the sort of the skills, the habits, the sort of the dispositions, some bits of knowledge as well that go into that package, so that they can access the curriculum and really succeed and thrive across the piece. And so we were very enthusiastic. We would go around to each other's houses and, planning the summer holidays and so on. So we were, quite unusually committed to making this thing work. And I'd just done a master's, which was the best professional development that I've ever done by an absolute mile. And I sort of had the bug for teacher research. And so I was looking for a topic for a PhD. And this happened that same month that we went back to school. And I just knew in an instant that this was going to be it. Because it was an incredible opportunity, 5 lessons a week with the whole of year 7. So, this is a crazy opportunity to do something really bold and different. I was keen to capture it in the most robust way possible, bearing in mind that this was like a real world situation. It wasn't an experiment that we set up. We were sort of putting this thing together on the fly. And so one idea that we had right from the outset, I used to work in neuroscience in various places. And there's this idea that's very common in medicine, this idea of a complex intervention that I mentioned earlier, sort of almost, it draws a little bit on the idea of marginal gains theory, this idea, like I said, that things stack up and interact. So it's like, so what are going to be the ingredients that go into our complex intervention? And so we started sort of piecing things together, and we were looking outwards to the research literature to a certain extent to see, you know, what is there evidence for out there in the world. But we were also trying to make things that, you know, bring to the party things that we were all very strong in and confident in, and things that we felt that our students needed. And so that was where it really started. And that was September. So it's literally 10 years ago and 1 month. So September 2010.
Which a time I remember well, and I was working in schools then, and I remember you know, doing a lot of work in the school I was working at, trying to, you know, the national curriculum at the time had come out, and we were all trying to embed personal learning thinking skills in our curriculum. And I think I'm not alone in saying that for me, my big takeaway from that period was, I don't want anything to do with this ever again.
Yeah,
it's a massive waste of time. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that you talk of, and it wasn't a concept really that I was familiar with before, was you talk about this period as the third generation of learning to learn. Can you tell us a little bit about the generations, these 4 generations?
Yeah. So this was something. Oh, do you want to talk to this, Kate? I'm happy to.
Yeah, but we do half and half if you like. It's kind of started back in the 70s when John Favell was talking about metacognition, and there was much more of an interest. The interest began in the processes of learning and how you can support children to learn more effectively. And at that point, it was much more about teaching practice, about how teachers teach and how they understand learning and how that can support students.
Yeah.
And then around the 80s, it shifted a bit, and it was much more about practical strategies to support learning. So revision techniques, how to answer exam questions properly, the kind of the nuts and bolts of appearing successful in performances and exams. And then it shifted. Then the big shift happened, which I think kind of created a big wave that was much more person-centered. So this is when we had all of the child-centered approaches. We had all of the stuff around the social and emotional aspects of learning. If children don't feel confident in themselves, then they're not going to be able to effectively apply the strategies that we're teaching them. So you can kind of see where the thinking came from, right? It's not just enough to teach them how to do it. They have to believe that they can be successful. And so with that thinking, I think came a rush of over-enthusiasm, perhaps, and everybody kind of joined in, and some practices snuck in at the same time that perhaps hadn't been quite so robustly measured. We weren't really sure if they would work, and people thought that they would work, and everybody said, yes, that sounds like a great idea, let's do it. And so I remember sitting through a CPD with SLT kind of doing this, and it was a brain gym thing, and they just looked like Charlie's Angels, and it kind of just and that was that adolescent phase that Guy Claxton, is very charitable when he talks about it's like a bad haircut, right? That you tried in your teens, and it led you towards what you know suits you. You kind of had to go through it, but you would never go back there and do it again. So that was kind of the third generation, and that's where I came up through teaching. So I was doing a lot of those things, and I could see the difference that it made in my students. I could see the difference that it made in their confidence, but it wasn't enough by itself. And I think I even allude to that in the book, that while I was trying to do all of this work to create a climate where they felt confident and able to attack learning effectively, there wasn't enough of them in it. So this fourth generation is about moving that responsibility from the teacher to create those conditions where learners can thrive, and making them an internal set of conditions that the learners take with them, whether you are in the room or not, whether they stay in school or not, wherever they go beyond the school gates, they still have all of the tools and strategies and relationships that they need to think their way out of a challenge when it presents itself.
Okay, and that was all of that was obviously very much part of the rhetoric in this third generation. So what do you think stops the fourth generation, the bit that you're promoting in the book? What stops it from being a bad haircut?
Well, partly it's the evidence that we have collected that suggests that actually we're moving things forward. We spend a long time, essentially the first half of the book. So in the start of the book, we talk about the learning to learn paradox, right? So on the one hand, you've got things like the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit that says that metacognition and self-regulation is one of the most effective games in town. That if you can get kids to reflect on their learning and to take some sort of ownership over their learning through planning, monitoring, and evaluating their own learning, that we see lots of gains in subject learning. And there's pretty robust evidence that you could point to to back up that claim. And on the other hand, you've got people like Tom Bennett, who describes in his book Teacher Proof, he describes learning to learn as a snake oil hoax. There's people like Dennis Hayes up at Derby University who talks about it just as this is like bad education. This is a bad idea. And so we see this really weird sort of polarization within the literature on learning to learn. It's either like one of the most effective games in town, or it's the road to ruin, you know. And then so we spend quite a lot of time unpicking what was going on there. And what happens is, so if you look at the literature, lots of the evidence that underpins that claim of the EEF comes from meta-analyses of small studies, right? And when you put all of those studies together, you find that there's some pretty robust, consistent evidence that you get fairly hefty effect sizes from these self-regulation and metacognition-based interventions. But what happened in around that period of time is that there was a number of examples that Kate mentioned just now. Opening Minds was one, building learning power was one. There was a thing called Learning to Learn in Schools that the Campaign for Learning did. And there was one called Learning How to Learn. There was those 4 big studies in the UK. Then that was where they tried to roll it up and evaluate these practices across, say, 30 or 40 different schools. And the implementation was pretty patchy across those schools. So if you read down into the reports, you find that where whole school implementation was achieved, there was some evidence of learning gains, but when you take all of those schools together, and it was this very sort of noisy system, if you like, the signal got lost in the noise, and it just the net effect was no clear impact, on learning outcomes, either positive or negative.
Yeah.
And so if you think about the evidence for and against learning to learn and what counts as a bad haircut and a good haircut, in the for column, we've got a serious amount of research literature suggesting that metacognition and self-regulation and oracy, which is the third sort of strand, if you like, of the third leg of the stool that we really promote in the book. There's loads of really strong evidence that those things improve not just learning outcomes in terms of exam results, but children's confidence, their ability to relate to one another, and so on. And then in the mixed evidence column, you've got these 4 studies where there's no evidence of impact either for or against. And then in the evidence against column, you've got tumbleweeds. Like there's nothing there really. There's no evidence that learning to learn is detrimental. So one of the arguments that we make in the book is that the death of learning to learn has been greatly exaggerated by certain people. Anyway, some people who've got quite prominent voices, like Nick Gibb would be a good example of that, where a few years ago he gave a talk at Research Ed where he was saying, he held up this report that was written a few years ago called like 2020 Vision or something. And he said, look at this, it's talking about children, working together and collaborating and setting goals and evaluating their progress. What a load of rubbish. This is all like for history, for the bin of history. And in that same talk, he was bigging up the EEF's teaching and learning toolkit, which, as we just said, in second place in that league table, we've got metacognition and self-regulation, which is almost a perfect description of what Gibb was dismissing. So we've got this very sort of like selective reading of the research literature, I think. And so without a doubt, there were some horrendous haircuts going on around that time. And like Kate said, things that seemed at face value, like they were intuitively appealing, like the idea of brain gym, the idea that you can use your mind like a muscle and that you can exercise it and get better at stuff. It's sort of, there's something appealing about that as an idea, isn't there? And likewise, with, learning styles, so many kids say, oh, I'm a really visual learner, say, or I'm not a visual learner. This language is in the society, and, people were doing these things in good faith.
Of course.
And, I don't think that that we need to be too harsh on ourselves. I know that lots of people who sort of underwent this Damascene conversion to much more sort of traditional ways of working, they feel, sometimes people talk about feeling quite angry about having been sort of led up the garden path by people, you know, who were too lazy to keep abreast of the latest literature. And I think that that's quite an unfair characterization of what was happening. These things were happening in good faith, but you know, we've learned some really robust lessons since then. And I think that the stuff that we talk about in this book is not really in that much danger of being another dodgy haircut, because of the way in which we frame this. Like, we're not presenting this book as a surefire recipe. We're like, here's a bunch of ideas that we think are good, but if you try to implement this in a top-down way, like, just don't. Like, don't do that, whatever you do. You know, take these ideas, but sort of put together your own complex intervention. And instead of asking, will this work for us? If you change that question to what will it take to make this work for us and for our students and for our, you know, for our context at this particular point in time, that shift in mindset is an absolute game changer. So I think that the way in which we frame how we think that this stuff should be implemented in schools will minimize and hopefully eradicate the possibility of any further haircuts.
Okay, that's really good. So I suppose the bit that maybe I'm not alone here. I think maybe many people might share this view that saying that on the one hand we've got the evidence base for metacognition and self-regulation, and on the other hand that supports what we were doing in 2010 in the name of learning to learn, might come as a surprise, because when I think back to the sorts of things that I was expected to do, they bore little or no relationship with what I now know to be the pretty robust research literature supporting some of those metacognitive and self-regulatory strategies. And so maybe there was an unhelpful conflation at some point down the line. But so what we're saying is, what the argument is that the fourth generation is essentially supported by the EEF toolkit that says that metacognition and self-regulated learning are up there as high yield potential strategies for students. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and it's not only the toolkit, you know, like if you look at
of course,
Dylan Williams' work, for example, around embedded formative assessment, he talks about 5 strategies that are really effective. And in 3 of those strategies, they're essentially about metacognition and self-regulation. He's talking about students activating themselves as resources, learning from one another, taking ownership, gathering evidence of learning. So I think that one of the things that's really key is that we're not saying all of that stuff that was being done back in the late noughties was good after all, and that we should revisit brain gym and learning styles. We went back to, we rethought this thing from first principles, and we've taken some interesting good ideas about what works from the literature, and we've got rid of a lot of dodgy stuff, and we've trial and errored this ourselves and gone through a serious process of research and development. It was an 8-year study that which we can go on to talk about. So, and also I think it's worth just saying briefly that we're not, when we're saying, we're talking about, moving away from a teacher-centric vision of education to a student-centric vision again. We're not suggesting that this has to happen across the piece. So we're arguing for having taught learning to learn lessons. So if you want to teach kids, there was a recent EEF study where they looked at project-based learning, and they found that project-based learning did not lead to improvements in English and maths. And you just think, well, that's not surprising, is it? Like, if you want to teach the kids English and maths, put the project-based learning down and teach them English and maths, And so we're not advocating that this should happen across the piece. But if your goal is to teach kids how to become more confident, more proactive, independent, sort of self-regulated learners, then that teacher-centric model won't do that, because, by definition, self-regulation can't be imposed from the outside. Like, you have to provide the space within the curriculum for the kids to grow into this new way of being. And then that does start to spill out into other ways across the curriculum, especially if you put in place strategies to help that transfer happen. So we're not suggesting that this is like an alternative to explicit instruction or an alternative to a knowledge-rich curriculum. we were talking with Jay McTighe the other week, and he was talking about seeing this as like, he described it as a meta curriculum that is sort of intertwined with a knowledge-rich curriculum, and the two complement one another really well. And I think that where things have been done badly in the past with learning to learn is when people have talked about it as something that happens in the absence of knowledge, and that's absolutely, you know, nonsensical. You have to have something that you're working with. So we're not, just to make that point really clear, we're not saying, you know, this is an alternative to the traditional model. We're saying it's a wraparound approach.
Yeah, understood. So, but I think what I was trying to say there, James, is that people who are people like Tom Bennett criticizing what they experienced, what many of us experienced in the name of learning to learn, is still a fair criticism, because a lot of it was eccentric, to say the least. So, but at the same time, there are very few people, I think, that would say we don't want students to be metacognitive, we don't want them to be self-regulated learners. I think it's probably fair to say that everybody wants students to become independent learners, and we want them to be critical thinkers and to be creative and problem solvers and all of that great stuff. There's no real debate about whether that's a worthy aim. I suppose the point of debate is, how do we go about achieving it? And that's where that's obviously that's a point of divergence of the book, which is quite an interesting one. And so a big part of the book is how you went about putting together your intervention at Seaview School. And Kate, I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit about some of the decisions you made, some of the things that were included in your Learning to Learn or Learning Skills program.
Sure. I think right from the outset, we had some very strong ideas about what we had seen working and what was supported by what other people had done and what they'd seen working and what there was research to back up. And one of those things was oracy, having a real emphasis on students being able to speak about lots of things with confidence, eloquently. And so right from the beginning, we set up our learning structure so that students could talk to one another all of the time. So they were talking about learning, they were learning through talking, that was a really big part of it. And so then project-based learning was a vehicle through which they could do that. And in order for them to be able to, I guess, develop those resilient traits that we want them to develop, we had to give them an amnesty, if you like, a way of being able to try them and fail without huge repercussions. And so one of the things that I think has always been a criticism of this way of learning is that if you are trying to learn maths in this way and you don't know what you're doing and you get it wrong, don't learn the maths that you need in order to move forward. So the most effective way to learn the maths that you need in order to move forward is for somebody to teach it to you properly.
Right.
But if you allow children the time and space to develop the skills and strategies that they need in order to learn something effectively, they can then apply them to mathematics later and be effective. So you kind of have to carve a space in your curriculum time where they can learn about something that they're not going to be tested on at the end of the year. So if it doesn't work first time, it's not the end of the world. So our projects were all very much knowledge rich, but it wasn't the knowledge that was in the rest of the curriculum. It was extra knowledge. And so we did that very deliberately in the beginning. Lots of opportunities for speaking and listening and getting to know one another, breaking down barriers. Lots of opportunities for having experiences that they could talk about and that they could test their newfound learning skills out on. So they were kind of the cornerstones that went in first, and then the rest was built on top of that as we went.
Right. Okay. And one of the things that I felt when I was reading through this part of the book, there's an awful lot, and as James was explaining earlier, you have this sort of additive approach, putting lots of different things in to hopefully harness cumulative effect. So I was reading through the list of all of the different things that were part of your real Rolls-Royce approach to this kind of curriculum. And in my head, I was thinking, do you need to have all of these? You know, what could you do without? There's a big ask to kind of get all of this in. There's a huge commitment the school has to make. And then towards the end of the book, I was slightly relieved to see that you had boiled the essentials down to a list of 5 non-negotiable elements that if schools want to put in place something along the lines that you did, these are the vital components to have. James, can you tell us a little bit about those 5 non-negotiable aspects of your learning program?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So it's not strictly a list of 5 non-negotiables. So are you talking about there's a chapter at the end of the book called an implementation checklist? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I am. Yeah.
So partly, you're right. It is partly about non-negotiables, but it's also partly about like how to go about implementing things. So
Right.
the first one in that list is about having what we refer to as a vertical slice implementation team, so that you have a team of teachers. This is something that I've been working on lots recently. Not just teachers, but teaching assistants, the Senko. You have a cross section throughout all different stakeholders throughout the organization, so that you, in the planning stage, you get people looking at this from multiple perspectives. So that's one thing that's much more of a sort of an implementation thing, but we think that that's best practice with regard to implementation. The second thing is timetabled lessons. So there's been this sort of debate raging since this, as Kate said, this thing's really got off the ground in the 70s with Flavel's work and Anne Brown and others. And there was a debate that sort of, picked up pace quite early on in that movement, which was like, can you teach this stuff as a separate, discrete course, or should it be embedded across the piece? And most people seem to sort of think, well, it should be embedded across the piece because things don't transfer very well. Right. And that's good in theory, but the evidence suggests that an embedded only approach doesn't work. And partly that's because teachers, there was a study done that we talk about in the book, where there's a study done where they were looking at, what do teachers understand by learning to learn? And for the majority of teachers think of learning to learn as things like those sort of study skills and exam techniques and mind mapping, and that's what we would describe as a narrow conception of learning to learn. And this broader conception that's much more to do with finding your voice and finding a greater sense of identity and self-actualization. Only a minority of teachers sort of buy into that. And even then, those teachers find it difficult. I used to find it really hard to find space to address this agenda within my role as a science teacher. And I believe in this stuff more than anyone I've ever met, pretty much, apart from Kate. And so we sort of thought, hedging our bets, you probably need to do both of those things. You need to have timetabled lessons, like Kate says, to carve out the space in the curriculum where the kids can take risks, they can get their teeth on, we would have half-termly projects and then step back and just allow them to really struggle, at first, not to the extent that they would have nothing to show for their time at the end of 6 weeks, but enough to find out what they can and can't do for themselves so that they can actually learn some strategies. So we would say that having timetabled lessons is a non-negotiable, but the extent to which that happens. So we had, as I mentioned, 5 lessons a week in year 7. And then when that cohort moved into year 8, the curriculum time expanded with them. So we had 3 lessons a week in year 8, 5 lessons a fortnight in year 9. So over 3 years, those kids had over 400 lessons of learning to learn. And again, we're not saying that that's the, gold standard Rolls Royce model. That's what we did. It might be that your kids need less. So it might be that your kids need more. We don't know. The evidence isn't in yet about what's the appropriate amount of time to spend on this agenda. So that's the second one, taught lessons. The third one, partly just because in taught lessons, we talk about things that you mentioned in oracy, things like debating skills. We want kids to develop really good debating skills, things that are developed really well in independent schools. And it takes a really long time to teach kids how to debate well. And if you think about, how could you do that within, with yourself as an English teacher? Can you think of, it would take us 5 lessons to prepare for one class debate. And in that debate, there would only be 5 kids who would actually have a speaking role. The rest were in the audience. There'd be 2 in the government, 2 in the opposition, and 1 that was chairing it. And so, how can you, if there's 5 lessons and even then only 1/6 of the class can take part in a debate, you need to find a way to carve out a chunk of time in the curriculum to do that work so that all kids can get really good at debating. And then when they go into history or drama or whatever, and they're asked to debate something, they've got the lexicon and they've got the skills and the experiences that they can draw on. So I could talk about that all day, as you can probably tell. Timetable lessons. The third one is embedded practices. So there does need to be some aspects of what's happening across the piece, that sort of what Dylan William referred to as like the common elements of learning across the curriculum in his lovely endorsement that he wrote for the book. Sorry, little snuck in a little name drop there. So that's partly to do with things like talk rules, like discussion guidelines, which we know is the most transformative thing that I ever did as a teacher, was introducing discussion guidelines to help kids to organize their thinking. Having things like a shared language of learning, so that the kids can, because if you've ever done that thing where you follow a kid throughout a whole day, and they're in music, then drama, science, PE, English, say, and it's wild.
We used to call that.
Sorry,
we used to call that pupil pursuit.
You're like literally chasing them around the school.
Yeah.
So it's a wild experience, isn't it? Because it's so sort of like a science lesson looks very different to a drama lesson, looks very different to throwing a javelin out on the school field. But if all of the teachers are framing their discussions about learning using the same sorts of language about modeling, about deliberate practice, about responding to feedback and so on, then the kids can get a much more joined up diet of learning across the piece, and they can start to see that these common elements apply, and they can see how they learn across the piece. So there are some embedded practices, and then linked to that is the fourth element, which is strategies for transfer. So the evidence on transfer, as you're probably quite well aware, is pretty complicated. It's not at all straightforward that things transfer from one context to another, even when the two contexts are quite similar, so-called near transfer. And that's not to say that transfer can't happen. Transfer absolutely can happen, and far transfer can happen, but you have to carefully manage that process in terms of the learning skills curriculum at both ends of the process. So the transfer out from the learning skills curriculum, and I'd be happy to talk about how we did that if you like, and then transfer in to subject learning across the piece. So that was number 4. And then the other two are sort of, implementation things really, rather than non-negotiables. The 5th one is ongoing monitoring and evaluation, to make sure that you're taking the pulse of this thing as things go. And as I say, like not just having this mindset of will this work here, but thinking what will it take to make this work here, and what's the data telling us, and what should we do more of, what should we do less of. And then the 6th one is visible leadership. So making clear that this, we were, just classroom teachers, right? The 5 of us who were in that initial group, we had the support of the senior team, but we've also worked in other schools where the senior team haven't supported this. This has been something that's much sort of lower down and hasn't been visible. And again, if you do that, it won't work. And a lot of that is about having communications planning, just thinking about how are we going to keep this a live issue on the sort of the mental dashboard of people all the way throughout this organization in an ongoing way. And we're talking about over a sort of 3 to 5 year implementation period. So they would be our non-negotiables in terms of what we think should happen in terms of implementation, but also we would very much like that checklist to operate as an evaluation checklist in the future. So if as we hope, this book leads to lots of schools, implementing similar approaches, that we can use that checklist as a sort of as a way to decide which schools to include, like selection criteria, which schools to include in studies. If schools have gone about doing it in this way, then we think that they're in with a shout of actually having the desired effect.
Okay, so just thinking about some of those things, Kate. So timetabled lessons and a almost a faculty of staff for teaching this. Those are huge commitments for a school to put in place. And one of the points you make early on in the book is that when we look at the research findings on metacognition and self-regulated learning, the EEF make the point that it's high impact for low cost. Do we have to accept the fact that if we want the kind of impact you're talking about, this has to be high cost, or are there ways of doing it which are genuinely low cost?
Well, it didn't cost us anything to do this. We used teachers who were already in the school. In fact, in our budget, we had more money at the end of the year than we had at the beginning of the year, because we brought donations in and we raised money for things that the students were doing. And in terms of, we didn't measure it, but I wish we had. There's a whole list of things that I wish we had also measured. And one of them is that because we were a team and we were timetabled at the same time, if any one of us was off sick, which we weren't that much, we could combine and work together. So there were fewer staff replacement costs. So as far as it costs money, no, it doesn't. There's a little bit of, I guess, training that has to happen in the beginning. You can read the book and that will take you through a large part of that for you. But we use the staff that were already there. And I think it's just about creating the space. If you want to achieve something I hate this word, I'm going to use it, and it nearly came out of my mouth, but it was all over the place when I was teaching, transformative.
Yeah.
You have to, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always had, right? That's what Stuart used to say to us all the time. So you have to do something differently. If you're just trying to shave a little bit of time and tweak a little bit there, you're not going to make such a big difference. I think it's worth the time investment because the return on that time investment is huge. Once you've got this stuff in Key Stage 3, it just stays. We stopped doing this at the end of Key Stage 3, and the results were still there at the end of Key Stage 4. So to me, it makes perfect sense to invest early and reap the rewards all the way through.
Okay, so just to sort of clarify what I meant by costs, I'm not sort of just talking about financial costs, but it's quite a bit of restructuring costs to take away those timetabled lessons from other areas of the curriculum and to refocus those staff, even if you're not recruiting new staff, to have them doing X instead. They can't do that as well as what they were doing prior to doing this. So it's quite a big commitment, even if it's not a huge financial outlay. And I think that's that's something that might be potentially scary to any school thinking of taking this kind of approach. And that they might well sort of ask, could we get an equally big impact doing something that seemed to have less cost implications, resource cost implications, but might net us similar kind of impact. So how do we sell the benefits of this approach to say that it's worth it?
Well, we can talk about the evidence if you like, that we collected, but there's also it depends on how you measure cost, right? So you're right. There's a cost in terms of curriculum time. In like those 5 lessons a week, lots of people's eyes widen when we say that, and they're like, "What lessons did that time come from?" Yeah, and what we found, as I said, that the curriculum time expanded into year 8, and when we went to that meeting with with all the other middle leaders, and we were saying like, "Can we have more time?" We were fully expecting, to be met with a wall of resistance, and we were just pushing at an open door because they could see in their classrooms, there was anecdotal evidence at first that, people were just saying these kids are different to other kids. There's a good example of that we talked to in the book. The head of PE, Caroline, talks about how these kids who'd gone through the learning skills curriculum were totally different. They were much more afraid, much less afraid of taking risks and making mistakes. They were much better, they were much more sophisticated, giving one another feedback, for example, and taking on leadership roles. So they could see the difference, and we were starting to see the impact in their mark books. And so we were pushing at an open door, which was really nice to see. But there is still that initial time investment. But then what you end up then with is there are so many kids, aren't there, who don't have those self-regulated learning skills, and so when they get to GCSE, they need to be intervened upon. Like the language of intervention is everywhere, isn't it, in schools? That we're having to put huge amounts of resources, pulling kids out of other GCSE classes so that they can be, focusing on, English and maths or whatever it is that, that the school needs to get their resources to. And an even bigger cost, I would argue, happens when kids go to sixth form and hit the year 12 wall, where they find that if they were bright enough to sort of breeze through their GCSEs and they thought, oh, this is a doddle, I'll be fine. All of a sudden, when they need to have those study skills, and it's not just skills, but it's like a way of being. It's being on the front foot and being proactive about your learning. Then they really struggle, and so many kids, hit that wall. And so I think that lots of schools would recognize that that's a strong argument for doing this work early on, so that you have to do less intervention in year 10 and 11 and less, kids changing courses and dropping out when they get to sixth form. So there's that. But and you know, there is a leap of faith, if you like, that this is going to, that these kids are going to be able to do more with less, in terms of curriculum time. But that is what we found, you know, because, you know, as I said, this first cohort that we did most of the analysis on, they had 400 lessons of learning skills throughout years 7, 8, and 9, and therefore the kids in the control group had 400 more lessons than they did of subject-based learning. And so you would expect, in the subsequent comparison of how they did in their subject learning, you would expect the control group to be doing better, right? Because they'd had a lot more time in those subjects. And yet by year 9 and then again at year 11, the kids in that treatment cohort performed significantly better than the kids in the control cohort. And so we can point to evidence that actually, you know, that they can do more with less, because if they're more switched on when they go into those lessons, they're more confident, they're more able to apply these strategies and these experiences to help them learn more effectively and achieve higher gains in their subjects across the piece. So that's what we found, and in particular, this was especially beneficial for disadvantaged children. So like non-disadvantaged children, non-pupil premium children in the treatment cohort performed better than non-pupil premium children in the control cohort, but it was especially beneficial for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the gap closed from the bottom up. By the end of year 9, it had closed almost completely. So in the pre-learning to learn in the control cohort, which is the previous year group, the pupil premium gap, if you combine all subjects together, was about 25%. And in the learning to learn cohort, the gap was just 2%. And we saw almost exactly the same pattern of results at GCSE, where the gap closed by something like over 70% from one cohort to the next. And I think that's probably the strongest evidence that we have, because obviously, you know, for us to say if kids did really well in that year group in their GCSEs, obviously how well a kid does in their English exam, say, is largely a product of how hard they worked and how hard their teacher worked, right? And so for us to say, actually, we think that at least part of this success is due to the learning skills curriculum, that's a bold claim to make, and we don't make it lightly. But through looking at lots of the work that we did alongside those sort of headline figures was looking at qualitative research evidence. So part of the program involved children writing in their learning journals, and we were asking them, you know, does this help you learn in maths or drama or art? And if so, how? Can you actually talk about how this transfers and helps you learn? So we got some evidence for transfer from that, and also by doing lots of student interviews and teacher interviews. And so we argue the case quite carefully, I think, that, you know, if the results have gone up and if the kids are able to say, yes, we think that this helped, and we can identify a number of mechanisms by which that boosted our attainment and helped us learn more effectively, and if teachers are saying the same thing, then I think that we can argue the case for causality. But I'll just add one more thing, is that this is one school, right? This was a pilot study, essentially, a long, in-depth pilot study. But it's one school, and we want to find out whether or not this can be replicated. Or I would bet my house on the fact that this can be improved upon, in fact, as we roll it out into other schools and in other countries and other settings, because we know so much more now about what we're talking about, and especially with regard to implementation, than we did 10 years ago. So I think we could argue the case.
Okay, well, it's a fascinating book, and it's as you just said, James. You've done a really careful job of trying to convince the horrible old skeptics like myself that the evidence is in your favour, and I would absolutely agree. And I think I said at the start, before we started filming, that I'd agree with probably about 80% of the things that you're suggesting are good strategies for teachers, and where we might quibble is obviously interesting and all the rest of it. And you do make the point later on in the book that the school doesn't have to do everything that you suggested. It doesn't have to do it exactly the way that you went about it, but that's a template that's out there that schools could try and replicate if they wanted. So it's a bold argument, and it's a bold piece of work, and you should definitely read it. In the chapter which James was just talking about causality and generalizability, I definitely recommend that you give that a read and come to your own conclusions. But Kate, James, thank you so much for allowing us to waste so much of your time on for you, Kate, on a lovely sunny morning, it looks like, in the Dominican Republic.
You might have just seen my daughter crawl across the back of my camera to say it's nearly time to go horse riding. Hurry up, Mum.
The pressures, the pressures.
We should be careful what we wish for, because through this journey, Kate has become so good at self-regulation. She's self-regulated herself all the way to a Caribbean island.
There you go. That's what you got to be careful about. So, Fear is the Mind Killer, published by John Catt, written by James Mannion and Kate McAllister. Thanks. We're going to give away a couple of copies of the book to viewers on the show a week after this is aired. But thanks ever so much for your time tonight, and I wish you every success, both in the Dominican Republic, and I think you're just in Brighton, aren't you, James?
I am indeed.
Someone's got to be there. But thanks ever so much, and hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you.
Cheers,
Thank you
David.
ever so much for having us on, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.